Tell me about Collateral, because I think a lot of people are thinking, what is this stuff that the cult does? It's got the executive success program. It's got this weird sorority of people that turned out to be kind of like sex slaves. But how are you bonded in this organization? Why not just leave? And that's where Collateral comes in.
Two things. That's like the number one thing people ask me right at the beginning. Like, why would you give them a false confession or a photo or things that you wouldn't want leaked to the public? And the concept of Collateral had been built in 3 to 4 years, maybe even longer before that. Keith was so brilliant at the long game, and say brilliant, like sociopathically brilliant.
Yeah.
Knowing that he had to like plant seeds and build and build and build. In fact, he even taught a class about how true sociopaths play the long game.
Wow.
They don't just like key your car if they're mad at you. They'll like slowly poison your dog over many years and watch you suffer. So Collateral is, I think, a good example of that. We'd been doing it for years as a practice in terms of putting something down as a weight for your word. Like, I say that I'm going to go to the gym, and if I don't, I'm giving you this collateral, Nippy, I give you permission to give $500 to charity or whatever. Like, there is something that you'd place, like the same thing collateral is used to purchase a home or any big asset, right? But it became more personal and more damaging.
But just one caveat, Sarah. Yeah. Those are clear exchanges.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Right. So.
You know what the exchange is. And so it felt like in that community that was a normal thing.
Right,
it became very normalized.
So this is like, hey, if I don't quit smoking, you're going to write a $500 check to the white supremacist nationalist party. And I really don't want that, so I'm not going to smoke. That's the collateral. Whereas this was more like, I just have damaging stuff on you that I'm going to keep for an unspecified period of time to be used whenever you don't do what I want you to do.
Exactly. Well, it wasn't quite presented that way. I was invited by Lauren, who's my best friend and somebody I trust probably more than anyone other than my husband. And she's saying, I'm going to hold this to make sure you stay on track. And in that context, if what she was saying was true, and it wasn't a women's organization started by a man who's collecting collateral for his spank bank, then it might have been a nice thing to have a sisterhood where someone's keeping you on track and you're accountable to somebody. But it wasn't.
Not with nude photos.
You don't need nude photos to do that.
Right.
Well, it's important to add that.
Yeah. So the nude photos took things obviously to the next level. I'm just saying, for people who don't understand, this is 12 years in. This is in a community where I trust everyone. I think that the people who are helping me have my best interests at heart, and that this exercise that we're doing is an exercise and it's a game. She's not really my master and I'm not really her slave. We don't even live in the same city. Like, it's just an exercise. It's a title. It's like guru disciple. Everything was like, it's just this. It's not a big deal.
When do you realize that you are in a cult? Right, because Mark Vicente, your friend and colleague in the organization, he says, we didn't join a cult. Nobody joins a cult. We joined a movement to do good. And I like that, because I think, and he comes across as a pretty smart dude. I think his point was that smart, reasonable people can get caught up in organizations like this. And the organization either becomes a cult over time, or it reveals itself to be a cult over time. The point is, because a lot of people are going to go, I would never get caught up into this. And it's like, well, you don't go, hi, I need to join your cult. I'm here to join your cult. You join because you think it's going to help your acting career or your business or something along those lines. And it's the frog in the boiling water concept. You just don't realize it's boiling because it happens so slowly, and you start to you're rationalizing it yourself over a period of months or even years.
Thank you for summarizing our main message from the past 5 years. That's really it. I mean, That's something that we've been really passionate about. But it's changed. Like, when we got out 5 years ago, it was more skepticism and a lot more of like, that could never happen to me. And now, thank you to The Vow and many documentaries about cults that I know that you're a fan of, not just The Vow. I think people are more on that side, a little bit like, well, I might not have joined NXIVM, but I definitely would have joined CrossFit or like that church or that yoga studio or whatever. There's different draws depending on what people's values are. But for us, in terms of how we woke up, there were so many things. I mean, there's so many red flags along the way from day one, literally from day one. But as you probably know from watching The Vow, we were trained to override our intuition. We have the feeling if something's not right, there must be something like a limitation within me. I don't like the sashes. Oh, it's because I have authority issues. Oh, you're right. I do have authority issues. Okay, I'll stick it out. I'm not going to say anything.
one thing too, Sarah, caveat to that, like with the sashes and those things too. Yes, they seem weird, but when you're in a curriculum and they're saying, human beings generally establish rules and rituals. We're emulating the dojo system as a ranking system. I'm like, okay, I can get on board with that for today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For today, right? And there was other things that they kept going. They minimized the weirdness pretty well. And they got good at minimizing the weirdness to the point where like, okay, I'll stay for a couple days. I'll do my 5-day, because I can remember for me, it was, I'm gonna do my 5-day and I'm peacing out. Right? And then over time, I took a class here and there, and it was a slow kind of burn, if that's right, to your point, to the frog in the water. Sorry, Sarah. I thought it was good to get people to understand the good of why you would stay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
right.
The example they also gave was like when you go to someone's house and they take off their shoes at the house, like you take your shoes off. Mm-hmm. Even if you like, it's going to ruin your outfit. Maybe that's more of a woman thing, but like, okay, I'll take my shoes off because it's your house and that's your rules. So that's sort of how it's presented. It's like, it's what we do here while you're here. Wear the sash, take your shoes off, and we bow and say thank you, Vanguard, after every class because he created the curriculum.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you're like, okay, it's a little weird, but who cares?
Yeah.
I can deal with this for 5 days, whatever.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We even had a class about what a cult is because we were taught that people are going to say you're in a cult and how do you respond to that? And we had a whole diatribe about that. And I didn't mind that objection because I knew how to handle it. And specifically it was, people use the word cult, and I think this is true, when they just want to say something's bad, but they don't say specifically what's bad about it. Are you murdering children? Are you drinking Kool-Aid? Are you stealing people's money? Are you creating dependency? Are you isolating them from your families? No. So we couldn't see the bad thing. So we saw the bad thing eventually, which is all of those things, being isolated, creating dependency. There's a lie. There's a con. There's sex happening. Like sex in itself is fine. But the fact is that he's saying he's celibate. And now we find out that he's got a harem.
Right, the cult leader, yeah. I'm celibate, except with the 5 underage women that I have locked in rooms in houses around the neighborhood.
Like, do you know what a betrayal it was to find that out after I've spent 12 years being like, this is Keith Raniere's most noble, humanitarian, ethical man in the world who created the most incredible curriculum that changed my life, who also has a harem of women and he may or may not be poisoning them. That's a whole separate.
Oh my God, I didn't even see that thing. But in the book, you mentioned a friend of yours tried to tell you that NXIVM was a cult early on. I assume when that came in, you were like, oh, I took a class about this. I'm going to tell you why you're wrong or ignore it or whatever.
Yeah, I was like, I get it. I'm like, if I didn't know what we were teaching and just looking at it from the outside, I think it was a cult too. And maybe it is a cult, but it's a cult of happy, successful people. And,
that's a cult I can get behind, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I mean, look, it's so interesting. In season 2 of The Vow, Nancy really grapples with the paradox of NXIVM looking back, that a lot of what the organization taught, the core curriculum, outside of the horrible, dark stuff Keith was doing, that material was still possibly good and valuable and maybe designed to help people. And I'm sure she was somewhat biased because she created the program. But as she comes to terms with how bad Keith really was, she starts to ask herself, like, was the curriculum actually good? Or did Keith just create the good or have me create the good in order to justify or enable the bad? I found that so interesting, whether the teachings of NXIVM are still useful in some way, or if they were, corrupted and manipulated to serve Keith's agenda. What's your take on that?
I would say because the curriculum never opened itself up to standard practices where we have in our society agreed upon these are standards you should meet and all that stuff, we're never going to know. We do know that it was stolen from a lot of different places. Sarah and I have subsequently gone out and find books. I think Marty Lefkoe, is that the
Marty
Lefkoe method?
Lefkoe is a method that we think he stole the EM
He
tech
ripped from. I read a book called Power versus Force by David Hawkins, and down to the examples in the book, where some of the examples in the modules, almost he was too lazy to change the language. I read it and was like, fuck me. I was like, what the shit? I was like, this is exactly like I could have read this.
Right.
And so there's a lot of that. And I don't know how much more there is. I just think that he was effective at cobbling together basic, self-help stuff, putting it into packages that were pretty digestible so people could have some shifts, and then had to keep the gig going. And Nancy was more than willing to do it. knowing what she knew. So anyway, go ahead.
Just to add to that, and I agree with Nippy, we don't really know, but the jury's out. Like there's people in NXIVM who are like, fuck all this, baby, throw the baby out, got to start again. I spent 12 years there. Nippy in and out for 16. I didn't want to do that. And I did get a lot of value. I just had to find out where it came from originally. So I don't have to say, thank you, Vanguard, after, being more productive with my time or communicating better, or lots of things that I learned were not from him.
Sure.
And I do think if you pull all these things, and also Scientology, which is actually from like other things, like the good parts. There's good parts in all of these things. Otherwise, why would people stay?
Sure.
It doesn't justify staying. It just, you have to understand why people would even join. There has to be good tools. And most of the good tools, like you can find in books and other leaders that are not culty.
Yeah, they're sort of universal and ancient. I mean, some of this stuff is in so many
ancient.
other texts. I mean, do you guys ever find yourself still using NXIVM techniques? And do you ever like turn to each other when you get into a fight and you're like, babe, let's EM that, like talk about that?
We actually joke about it a lot.
Do you?
Like, use the language in a jokey.
She'll get mad at me and I'll be like, that's your life issue.
Yeah. Maybe we need to go visit Keith in prison and hash this one out between the bulletproof glass or whatever you have in the prison. I'd like to talk about some of the classic cult tactics that Keith used to keep people on the hook, sniffing out their vulnerabilities, leveraging them. One example is punishing people's natural responses and intuition. You sort of alluded to this earlier. The skepticism, retaining personal control, wanting to protect your body, framing things like resistance to a concept as defiance in order to make people compliant. I mean, it's sort of gaslighting with a fancier label on it.
Yeah.
What else happened here? Because I think folks might be wondering, what does this guy say to you to keep you here or to wrap you up? It doesn't make any sense.
I think one of the first things is the creating the belief that we found the best thing, which creates an us versus them. So there was a sort of an internal righteousness, like for us as individuals, but as a collective. So the community that we came to love felt like they'd say things like, this is eventually like chosen family. So if anyone was criticizing, that created the isolation. They never said, there was never active, like you can't talk to somebody, but it was more like, well, what does it mean if you're communicating with somebody who doesn't support what you do?
Right. Okay. So then you almost come to the answer yourself, which is, it means
Yes.
I'm not committed. I've got one foot out
Right.
or whatever.
Right. It was always tacit instructions.
It's like leading questions too, that kind of, they hold you hostage with your principles in a lot of ways. And they make, like a question like that will go, well, my highest value is X, Y, Z. Obviously I should do this. But I think it's also case by case. Like I remember initially with my family, I chose once or twice chose a NXIVM event over seeing family. And I got a little pushback from that. And I evaluated it and was like, you know what? This isn't more important to my family. So from that point on, I never let a NXIVM event take precedent over a family event. And that was my boundary.
Which is probably why he stayed
For
orange.
whatever reason. Yeah, for whatever
sash.
reason. I like my family more than the people that in the cult.
Whereas
So
I
that
was more obedient.
I wouldn't even say I wasn't being obedient. I just decided,
They would have said that.
Yeah,
they would have said that.
Yeah.
They would have
They
said
would try
Nippy's being
things to get me
defiant.
to stay.
Yeah.
They would try to get me to stay and do things and be like, well, what's your highest value? And I'd be like, my family.
Sure. Yeah, and they're like, ooh, wrong answer. Or they'd reframe
Well,
NXIVM as your
even
family.
then, I'd be like,
right?
I would be like, that was solid in me, I guess.
And I think that protected you from future
I think so.
abuse.
It protected you. Also, you never made brown belt or whatever, brown sash.
And that was fine with
Yes. I've been in these groups not deep enough at all. I've taken like the intro seminar to some of these things, and it's funny because these people add you on Facebook, and a year later or something on their birthday, back when I used to do this, I would check in and say, how are you doing? Happy birthday. And some of them were still in the group, and it was mind-blowing because I thought, this is such a weird, oppressive group with a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of really inappropriate use of influence. And since I'd been studying this stuff, teaching this stuff, doing this podcast for so many years, I remember being like, this is a really creepy way to do the upsell to the advanced program. And one of the program, I don't mind naming it, it was called MITT. My opinion is that it was really creepy, and it was also a offshoot of something called LifeSpring, which got sued into oblivion back in the day.
Yeah.
So you probably heard of this. And I just remember they would say, like, anybody who wants the advanced, go in this other room. And then there'd be this group of 40 of us left, and then he'd go, come up to the front of the stage. And he'd be like, why is it that you're so resistant to continuing your education with us? And somebody would say, I can't make the dates because it's my best friend's wedding shower or something next weekend. And then the guy would just drill into them. How often do you make excuses to not do things for you, to do things for other people? And she's like, well, this friend actually, I'm kind of on her shit list because I missed other things in her life that were really important for work. And they would go, oh, so your friend doesn't support your work or your personal development? And I'm sitting there going, no, she's been a shitty friend. She needs to go to this important life event for her other friend. Yeah. Have her go to the one that you're having in a month. And they're reframing it as, this is a bad friend. She's holding you. I'm thinking this person's holding you accountable. And they're like, no, this person's holding you back in life because they don't want to let you go to our $500 weekend-long thingamajig instead of her frickin' wedding shower. Right. And
Jordan, you just described the exact conversation I had 2 years in, and I didn't go to my best friend's wedding because of Vanguard Week. I was going to leave early. And then they were like, why would you leave early for someone who doesn't support your values?
Right. Right. And it's like,
is she taking trainings with you? Why would you go there? You know, same thing.
To me, it's crazy. But when you're in the room, and they had this poor woman, of course, she's standing up because he's making her stand. Everyone's staring at her. So she's got all this social pressure. And if you don't agree, you look really bad. There was a doctor in the room who said, I can't make it because I have surgery scheduled. And it's like, well, you need to take time and do the development for yourself. You're never going to advance in your career as a doctor. And he's like, I'm the chief surgical whatever at this hospital, and I'm the only person who can perform this not even a tonsillectomy. It was like a very serious whatever. It's like taking someone's pancreas out or something. You know, it's like a real thing. And they just kept making this guy look like crap, and they finally were like, you're uncoachable. And he's like, fine, I'm uncoachable, but I have to do this. I'm saving someone's life here. And he walked out. And I remember thinking, like, that guy has the right idea. This is a smart person who wasn't about to take your shit. And they knew that from stage, and they kicked him out of the room because they realized, this guy is not going to be pliable. And also, I think there was probably, when you're on stage, maybe you can hear the murmurs of people going, it's a surgery, man. It's important. This guy's a doctor. You know, he had some authority by virtue of his position. And they did not want him in the room for that reason. They want people who are just going to be like drones and listen to anything that's coming from the stage. And I think, you know, when you really do need a background in influence and persuasion and cults. Otherwise, you just kind of sit there and, smart person or not, you just get sucked in. It's really easy to see.
Yep. 100%.
Absolutely.
I wish I'd said more things like that doctor. Knowing what I know, I mean, obviously, I actually think I wouldn't even gone to the 5-day because they pressured me with signing the application to get the discount. And I think I would have said, actually, I feel pressured and I feel like you're using scarcity mentality to get me to commit. And if this is really great, it'll be here when I'm ready. So thanks. But I didn't know that.
Right.
But it's so interesting because in the book, Sarah, you talk about struggling to engage with one of your early trainings where you guys had to write a personal mission statement or something like that. And you broke into a sweat, and you say that you struggled to face your personal flaws, and you were kind of jarred, I think, by some of the stuff you were confronting about yourself. But as it turns out, the NXIVM coaches, you said, were looking for your reaction. In their eyes, your sensitivity or your resistance to the curriculum actually strengthened your potential as a candidate for being a lifer in ESP, according to them. This is a fascinating paradox, this idea that like your healthy resistance to a curriculum that was ultimately it was questionable was actually an asset. What did they mean by that? Did they mean that you were an easier mark because you were a thinking person? Or were they trying to lower your guard by saying that your skepticism meant that somehow you would go further in the organization?
You know, I don't really know. That there's answers that are still out there that I'm still figuring out. I can guess what I know now is that anything that they saw that they could flip for their own benefit, they would. So I was a mark for a lot of reasons, being a natural recruiter. Like I have a big network. I'm really passionate about things that I believe in, even like what we're doing now on the other side of it all. I'm still the same person. But I think the fact that I was like I was in a meltdown. I wasn't happy. Like if somebody had said, let's go, I'll take you to the airport right then, I would have gone. But I had invested and I wanted to get, my money's worth. And I think they just saw dollar signs with me in terms of what I could bring to the company, which I did. And anything I presented, they'd tell me why I was great. Like they made me very special. Yeah.
Got it. So they saw the skepticism that like that surgeon at that event might have had, and they maybe were threatened by it or concerned about it, but anything that they could use to keep you guys in, they would use. So that just became an asset and they just flipped. Okay, got it.
I definitely saw them doing what they did with that surgeon. If people were super resistant to the sashes and they refused to wear them, for example, they'd ask them to leave. Mm-hmm. Like they just weeded out the people who were not compliant right from day one.
Also, like there's an assumptive manipulation that goes on there that Sarah's going to continue. So they say, oh, your XYZ will allow you to be a great recruiter and you can build a center here. So they're creating the hope. It'd be like me saying your smooth voice will make you a great head trainer. So I'm getting you to picture yourself as a head trainer, and I'm planting the idea, and like it's all this cultivating kind of mentality they have to get people
right. Yeah,
dangling like the carrot of whatever's important for that person.
And based on what I listed about your values, let's say I know you're ambitious to make money, but like you can make a lot of money as a head trainer. Just.
Can you discuss the premise of the cult that you were in? I mean, you said pedophilia for God, and I think people were like, come again? Because that phrase alone is pretty tough to swallow for, I think, most people. It's just like, you got to be exaggerating. I think that's where most people probably start when they hear this.
Yes. So it started in 1968, which, to put in context, this was the time of the hippies, right? The free love movement, and new religious movements were basically a dime a dozen. People were getting all into them. And so our leader, David Berg, was already this failed preacher who came out of evangelical Christian tradition and kind of found his spot with his teenage children recruiting hippies in California. And it started off love, faith, Jesus, very supposedly wholesome, right? Very much with this revolutionary, this is the prophet of God. We are living in the end of days, and we are on this mission to win the world for God. Over about a decade, it went from love, faith, Jesus to using his female followers as religious prostitutes. So based on this verse in Matthew, I will make you fishers of men. And they called themselves flirty fishing. They called themselves hookers for Christ.
Wow.
And it was very deliberate. You are going out and you are using your body and your sexuality to gain converts and to gain money. And he, first started with this concept of sexual control. And I think it's exactly what evangelical purity does, which is try to control you and your sexuality all through your life. And all he did was flip that and say, sex is love, love is God, and God loves everyone. And so the idea was free love. The result was forced polyamory, religious prostitution. And then when the kids came along, so my mother was one of the first children born into the cult, the kids got absorbed into this idea of raising sexually liberated children.
Oh God, there's so much to unpack, and all of it is kind of gross, but let's, and I'm sure you don't mind me saying that, right? But
not at all.
I think religious prostitution, people are still probably like, okay, but what is it really? So what is it really? Because it's just like it sounds, which it's so hard to believe. And I was listening to the audiobook and I'm like, I got to rewind this. Did she actually just say that this is what was happening? Because there was a lot of stuff that was so unbelievable that I just wanted to make sure I heard it clearly. Because I'm often multitasking when I read. I'm working on a car or something, and I'm like, I gotta rewind this. Did she say that you have to share your wife with other guys in the cult? Okay, that's kind of culty, very not seemingly very Christian. And then it's like, but wait a minute, they are also literally prostituting themselves, and this is how they generate revenue or something for the cult. Can you explain this a little bit? Because that does not seem, I haven't read the Bible recently, but it's probably a stretch to find that in there.
So the whole, I guess, thing with cults is it hinges on your absolute belief in one concept, which in this case was that this man was the prophet of God. I think, honestly, this is why they couldn't break me, because I never believed in this concept. And so I was just like, my whole life, right? These people are crazy. But once he's put his followers through this process of a decade, right, of isolation and of self-sublimation, because the other big thing about cults is you are asked to sublimate yourself, right, lower your individualism, make sacrifices in order for the good of the group and the ultimate mission. Mm-hmm. At which point, anything you start becoming asked to do seems reasonable because you're doing it for this mission, for this purpose, right? The ends justifies the means.
Right.
And so again, he walks his followers into it a little bit at a time. First, he sets his wife aside and takes a young wife and nobody says anything. Then he says everyone needs to start sharing sexually with each other. And then he says, well, what a great gift of love that the Lord has given us, right? These beautiful women and their beautiful bodies. And if this is God's way of bringing, men and money into the group, then all the better. And it, nobody ever called it religious prostitution. They called it their own thing. They gave it their own terminology, their own sort of thought-stopping cliche around it. And then it just became part of the fabric of the group.
I assume also that, look, you're a fighter. If you walk around with a black eye, no one's going to be like, oh my God, what happened? It's like, well, you punch people and get punched for a living. So
yeah, so it was a
part of the drill.
It was super common for me to have black eyes or grab marks on me from grappling. So it was never a question by anybody at my job or, I had a lady come up to me one time and give me a card and be like, do you need help? And I was like, no, I'm a fighter. This is what I do. So my mind was so bought into the narrative too, that I couldn't even really wrap my head around what was really happening. And nor did I want to, because then again, I would be admitting that I was losing and that I was failing.
Yeah.
So
good for that lady handing you a card, though.
I know.
That's a guts, because that's like
she was like the
good
only
on her
person
for doing that. That's a shame. That's a shame. I feel like you'd like to think, I would do that too, but I don't even know what would be on the card.
Yeah.
What goes on the card?
It was
right?
like
What do you even
some
call?
woman's shelter. It was like some abuse woman's shelter, and I was like, that's ridiculous. I'm not being abused.
Oh man, the gaslighting or the gaslighting,
the disassociation. Right? Yeah, it was so, but that's what your mind does to protect you.
Sure.
So, I mean, most trafficking cases, women are addicted to drugs in the process as well. That's super common, and it's used to help kind of keep them captive, right? On my case, I didn't have any drugs because I was fighting and therefore being tested constantly to make sure I wasn't using performance-enhancing drugs, which was awesome because I'm super grateful I didn't end up being addicted to anything. But
no kidding.
It means I was present for everything. So I disassociated and still struggle with disassociation pretty hardcore. I can turn my emotions on and off like a light switch, no problem. Staying engaged in the present is a very intentional thing I have to do.
That's interesting. Yeah, a lot of abuse victims talk about like I left my body during this experience. And I guess is that dissociation?
Yeah.
What you're talking about?
Yeah. So you're outside of your body. It's almost like this is happening to me in a different time and space, and I'm over here observing. The one interesting thing that seems to stay intact for trauma survivors is a sense of smell. So they'll remember how it smelled. And I think that's super interesting.
That is interesting. And also sounds kind of horrible because like that's one, I mean, not to get graphic here, but that's like one thing I definitely wouldn't want to remember probably.
Yeah. Like they remember, like obviously the smells you can think of, but also like the abuser's cologne, and like the bread bakery down the store. So that's what makes it so interesting, because they'll get triggered by the most random things, but it's whatever was happening in that situation as well.
There's something that I don't know if this is junk science, but I remember hearing about this a long time ago, probably on a podcast, which are full of junk science, by the way, that like smell goes directly to your memory in some ways. And it's why you can smell something that like you can smell some cologne that like your grandpa used to wear that you haven't smelled for 30 years and you're like, oh my God, grandpa. And it's like, no, you're just in the perfume aisle at like an old guy department store and they sprayed it.
I've found that to consistently be true with my own life and also with all the victims I've worked with as well. So just interesting.
It's one of the reasons I think why food is so, it helps people connect to culture and nostalgia, because you smell like, oh my gosh, is that vodka sauce with a little bit of whatever my great grandma used to use in there? And it's like, you know, a rare recipe you never, and you just immediately are transported back, for better or for worse. Ideally, this is something that you love and it's something that makes you feel like a kid again because you're smelling a plant that used to be at your uncle's house growing up, but it can also work for horrible things, which had never occurred to me at all. So the dissociation, it almost sounds like a superpower, but like you said, it can be, it has a downside. I'm wondering if you're disassociating from yourself and seeing your body from the outside, like you're floating, does that mean you disassociate from good things as well? I mean,
yeah.
If you're not careful?
Oh, 100%. So after I got out and I went through therapy and I'm working to help bust trafficking rings and help survivors, I meet my husband. And so learning to engage in a healthy relationship with a man, super difficult. And you don't want to get attached to something too much because that was also used against you when you were being victimized. So one time I showed too much interest in a rifle that my trafficker had. And so he ended up raping me with the rifle to teach me a lesson. So I learned that I could not get attached to anything because it'd be used against me. And so moving forward through life and being able to enjoy things is a very intentional thing for me. I have to be, otherwise there's no emotional connection. So that's definitely been a massive process, learning to let myself feel, let myself love, let myself be happy, and ignore the narratives that were implanted and enforced by trauma.
It does sound like if you end up dissociating from everything, that sounds tragic and depressing, if that's even the right word for it, right? It's just like you want to be able to enjoy good things and focus on them while also not necessarily always reconnecting to all these negative things that have happened in your past. I mean, that seems like it would make therapy a relatively complicated affair.
Yeah, so feeling nothing is worse than feeling depressed. So a lot of people who have practiced disassociation on a regular basis will make horrible choices just to feel something. So they'll make their partner mad because it's something that's familiar, so that they can feel something. And also something that was super scary for me is I never saw my husband angry. And so I didn't know what would happen if he got angry. And that was a very scary idea. I don't know how bad it would get. So with my trafficker, I knew how bad it would get. With my husband, I didn't know because he wasn't an angry person. And so I remember having to have a conversation with him about that, of like, it freaks me out that you don't get mad because the story in my head is you're going to snap and beat the living daylights out of me.
Interesting.
So yeah, like a lot of people will self-sabotage if they don't get healing in order to feel something, or commit suicide or self-harm just to feel something.
Wow. That conversation with the husband would be a little, like, could you be more of an asshole actually sometimes, just so I know you're still there and checked in?
Well, and what's interesting too is when we first met, I would always text him everywhere I was going, everything that I was doing, every second. And he's like, why the heck are you doing that? Like, I do not need a play-by-play, but I was so used to being controlled. I was trying to like force him into this spot to control me because that felt good for me. And so that's something that I had to work through and recognize and be like, oh yeah, he doesn't want to control me. Am I okay with that?
Right. Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. Like, I can imagine a normal guy being like, congrats on getting a Chipotle bowl, I guess. See you later.
Yeah.
Like, not to make light of it, but like, it would be confusing if somebody did that for me. Like, okay, great. I don't like, how do you react if you're not trying to control a person to somebody who's slipping into that role? Did it just wear off after a while? Or like, of course you went to therapy, but did you just realize after a while, okay, he's not requiring this behavior of me?
Yeah. I remember like a couple times I forgot to, and I was like, like I started to have a panic attack of, oh my God, I didn't tell him, that I was going to be late or that I had to do this. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And he's like, it's fine. Like, I just figured you'd get home when you get home, and love you. See you later.
Yeah.
Mind blowing.
Yeah. Wow. Right. Because your whole life has been sort of overly controlled by men. Oh, that is fascinating. It's so hard to teach those patterns.
Something's familiar does not mean it's healthy. And the majority of time, it isn't healthy.
How do you know that everybody else went through that? I mean, it was clear that they did, but if you didn't ever talk about it, did you just know that somebody was missing for a while and you're like, well, they're probably going through the same thing as me because they went in the basement with creepy Uncle Jerry?
Yes. And, come to find out, everyone is, of course, not going through the same thing, right? And this is another way that survivors sometimes don't support each other. In the beginning, their sexuality stuff was very, very open. And then at some point, actually, when a 14-year-old got pregnant with me, they realized, oh, we can't have this evidence, right? So we're going to put rules in place. And this is when a lot of the survivors seem to believe that telling the pedophiles to stop raping the children worked. And I find that I find it surprising that people believe that, of course, but that's where we were. So, but it was this culture of you don't question the uncles, right? Anything the uncles do, they are the hand of God. So, and when someone has been separated and then they come back, the last thing you want to do is ask them what happened, because somebody else might tell on you. They might tell on you, or heaven forbid, I think you just have to face what happened. And again, we didn't, have the words for that.
So even you asking somebody else what happened would be considered you questioning the uncle's decision to do sadistic stuff to kids.
Oh, absolutely. And, heaven forbid you ask someone what happened and then you react negatively, right? Because that would really be judgment, right? Something like rolling your eyes could get you isolated for days, right? So we absolutely walked on glass, and it wasn't until decades later, I feel like, that we would all start talking about it. And this was another really interesting parallel to my time in the military, because I feel like it was the same thing. All of the women are going through the same mistreatment and the same kind of abuse, but we don't talk about it. That's the number one rule.
Some of the punishment that you describe in the book, aside from, of course, the I can't believe I'm saying this, aside from the child rape, some of the punishment was really sadistic. And it made me wonder, do you think the people that joined this cult were sociopathic pedophiles, or did they become that way when they joined the cult? Because I'm trying to figure out, it's like, if you offer me to join a cult and have some power, I'm like, oh, that's kind of appealing from a human. But if you're like, and you get to rape kids, I'd be like, dude, what? Ew, gross. So I would imagine these guys join because they get to do that with impunity. But I'm like, how did they advertise that? How do you find people that are going to be okay with that? And then you're like, hey, I got a secret. You can join this cult and do this all you want. That part I don't understand that. How do they... It's got to be part of the selling point to have these creeps join in the first place, right?
So, yes and no, right? So what we know about rape is it's not about sex, it's about power, right? So men primarily that get attracted to these patriarchal, high controlling, abusive religions, right? I don't think they have to know what the version of what they're going to be allowed to do is. It's just they're going to be given control. They're going to, be able to exercise their will over people. And I think, this is kind of what I call the difference between like the good uncles and the creepy uncles in the book. It's like there were some, like Uncle Jerry, like my biological father, who like were known to like young girls, right? And then there were many, I think, who went along with it when it was the thing to do. And then when it wasn't the thing to do anymore, they were like, okay, great. Now we can get back to loving God.
Wow. I've done shows on pedophilia, or in part on pedophilia, and one of the interesting paradoxes, I guess if you can call it that, is a lot of the guys, and it's usually guys that offend, that's engage in sexual acts with children, they're not actually attracted to children. It's just because they have access to children and they are psychopaths or sociopaths or otherwise enjoy hurting other people. It has nothing to do in many ways with sexual attraction. There are adults, of course, who are attracted to kids, and it's a disorder, and many of them actually don't offend because they know it's bad. So a lot of the guys that do offend, they know that it's bad. That's what they like about it, and they couldn't care less if it's a child or an adult woman or whatever. They just don't care. It's about hurting somebody else.
Yes, and that's exactly the case. And, you know, one of the other things, like the concept that I set out to write about in this book, is this group psychology concept that humans will do almost anything to fit in with groups that they've voluntarily chosen. And the Children of God had this very long-term, like 6-month onboarding process, very similar to how long it takes you to become a qualified soldier in the Army. And you didn't get to know any of the creepy doctrines until you had, you know, already given up everything for 6 months. At that point, I think it becomes so much easier to justify things, to go along with things. And for all of the adults, you know, they tell themselves, I'm this good person. And I have a chapter in my next book called There Were Good People in the Sex Cult too. Because even the ones that aren't the ones doing the actual abuses, right? They're reading the literature with all the naked children in it. They are seeing the things that are being done. They're seeing the children coming back out of the torture chambers, right? And they're not walking away. So, like, there definitely is a point where even the good people in really toxic environments are complicit, even though they might also be abused and coerced.
Is there any element of blackmail? And I'm not trying to make this cult worse than it already is, but I would imagine, like, let's say I go and join some cult like this in South America, and I'm like horrified at what's going on, and I realize that I'm complicit and I'm an accomplice to this horrible stuff that's going on. I almost would think maybe I can't leave, because what if I fly back to America? Is the cult going to be like, hey, this guy was around when all these bad things were happening. He's a criminal. I mean, I would, from a legal perspective, I definitely have criminal liability as a result of being around that and not doing anything about it.
I don't. So yes, what you're saying a little bit, right? So in 93, someone went on Larry King Live and had this discussion, right? That he said, like, I didn't want to do this. They made me do it. And, you know, he's talking about this 10-year-old girl that he was made to have sex with, who was the leader's daughter. And they did that to essentially have dirt on him. The 10-year-old girl was my mother. And he's trying to explain this, and he's trying to explain the coercive thinking. And, you know, it stands out because Larry King just looks at him and he goes, and you did it? Mm-hmm. You know, and a few days later, this man took his life. And I think the much more real threat here, and that the exit cost is not like legally you are going to be pursued, but it's just nobody is ever, you know, if you ever admit what it was really like and what was really done, nobody's ever going to accept you again, right? And that's really the worst punishment people can have. And that's what so many of us survivors, even that grew up in it, deal with. It's like we live, you know, for 10 years, I didn't say peep about it because I thought people would judge me so hard just from coming from that environment.